All right, so you don't mind if I record this and post it, right?
No, go ahead. I mean, you can do whatever. You can edit it or whatever you want.
Well, I might edit out like dead air and stuff like that, but I won't edit out any content that's meaningful. But if you say something
Right.
and you want to edit it out, like if you dox yourself or something, I can do that. Like I can
All right.
edit out something if you make a mistake and you want to reverse it or
Sure, sure.
whatever. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, did you think of a particular structure to this, or because I have like a an outline, I guess, or just like a couple of things that I think the atheist is just taking for granted without any justification.
Okay.
And maybe you can answer to those one by one or whatever. I don't
Yeah,
know.
we can do that. You can present your claims first if you want. I also thought we could go through your arguments against the article.
Sure.
If you want to do that, we can do that. Okay, so but first, yeah, you can present your position.
All right. So generally speaking, I think that the atheist or the materialist, which I don't fully know if you are, but most atheists are materialists. I mean that's like the whole point pretty much. But okay, anyway, so I have listed just five examples, five phenomena, so to speak, that I think are just not justifiable on that worldview. And the first of them being meaning, and so by extension, language, because whenever we use language, like you had this example when you say tree, and I picture like some tree in my head, for example, if that's how it works. If you then give me additional information. For example, you say, well, it doesn't have leaves or whatever, then I can adjust this picture in my head. And so that kind of shows you that you are not like working with particular examples, but with abstract concepts that basically don't exist in the material world.
Okay.
So yeah, so do you want to reply to this, or should I just keep going?
Yeah, sure, I can reply to that. So first of all, I'm going to frame this a bit myself, which is that we were debating theism versus atheism, right? And your big claim, and the big claim of people who, you know, are in that camp, like Jay Dyer, right,
Right.
is that the atheist has no answer to these philosophical critiques of knowledge, meaning, value, agency, etc. Right? These critiques of
Yeah, well,
consciousness,
uh, okay.
and the sort of implicit or explicit corollary is that the theist does, right? So that's the argument, right? That's what you might call you call the transcendental argument
Right,
is right.
right,
Okay.
exactly. Yes.
Okay. So we're going to get into that, and I'm going to claim that's based on some fallacies. The primary, I guess, the biggest one being the appeal to consequences. But I'll address these specific challenges. But I guess the point is that even if an atheist couldn't address these challenges, it wouldn't follow that the theist does have an answer. So
Right,
I'm going to make the
exactly.
claim that the theist has no answers himself. Okay.
Okay.
Or at least
Well,
no answers that would satisfy his demand that he's making of the atheist.
okay.
But,
So that
well,
last one I don't agree with,
I
but
know.
also it doesn't make sense to me to say just theism, right, or theist in general, because like there are different perspectives, and I would say that most of them, you're right, most of them can't justify the same things. But what I'm saying is the one that I am in favor of can.
Okay, so we can debate that later. I just wanted to frame it so that it's clear why we're going into these philosophical questions. Okay, so how do we have meaning? How does language have meaning? How do our ideas represent reality? That's what you're asking, essentially, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, here's my answer, is that our brains evolved to model reality. Okay, we have a mechanism that I'm going to call induction that induces abstract ideas or abstract concepts from experience and then applies them back to experience to interpret experience and to generate action. So that our brains are our general purpose, or at least the cerebral cortex is a kind of general purpose induction or pattern abstraction and recognition machine. That's what it does. And a concept such as tree is something that you and I have both abstracted from our experiences because we have the same kinds of brains, we have the same structures in our brains. We evolved, we're part of the same species, we evolved the same abilities more or less, and we've had common experiences. We've lived in a world that has trees, and those trees interact with our senses and our muscles in pretty much the same way. Like we have the same kinds of bodies, we have the same kinds of emotions, we do the same kinds of things, and so our brains have abstracted similar concepts. And language is based on this underlying common ground that we inherit, partly cultural, because we have to know the language, right? That's another thing. We have to learn the language, right? But we've also learned the abstract concepts. So we've learned these abstract concepts, and we've learned this association between words or language structures and thought structures. So when I emit a sequence of sounds, your brain interprets that as, oh, this thought structure. And you generate this idea in your head that is similar to the idea I have in my head. Well, if it works. It doesn't always work, right? But when it does, that's what happens.
Well, my basic claim is on your worldview it should never work.
Why not?
Well, because my brain is, although you say it's similar in structure, it's of course a different brain. It's not the same brain that you have in your head. And so when your, I don't know, synapses, I guess, are firing in your brain and creating language, and then you transmit those sounds to me, I shouldn't be able to understand them because
why not? I've just explained
the atoms in my brain are different from the atoms in your brain.
Well,
so how is it then that a sense of a word or of a sentence structure can be transmitted from your brain to my brain?
I just explained it. It's not like I transmit exactly what's in my head to you, exactly the same synapses fire, exactly the same atoms are jiggled, electromagnetically. It's that something analogous occurs in your brain because you have induced
right.
the knowledge,
okay,
the same kind of knowledge, same kind of general knowledge that I have induced. And so when communication works, it's just like any other, like we have analogs to this, and we send a signal. Like let's take a microphone. There's a wiggling piece of paper with little magnetite particles in it or something like that, I think it's just a piece of paper that's attached to a magnet that wiggles in and out in an electric coil, and that generates an electrical type of signal, which then goes down a wire to a speaker, which then wiggles another thing. So what's happening in the microphone and what's happening in the speaker are not exactly the same, but they're analogous. The motions of the paper, the diaphragm in both of those devices is analogous because they're connected by this causal link, right? So it's a very similar notion that things can be causally connected, and then you can send a signal, which is a kind of, and create an analogous effect in one that you have in the other by tying them together causally. So that's what happens.
Right, but I mean, language doesn't necessarily produce the same reaction in everyone, right?
Right,
I mean,
because
you might react angrily to something that I find funny or something like that, but we still the meaning is still objective. Like the reaction can be something else, but the concepts are universal.
No,
so
they're not, because the idea of a tree in your head might be different from the idea of a tree in my head, and even There are other things that you might not have concepts for things that I have concepts for, and vice versa. It's not like there's some, like, I know what you're thinking about, this Platonic ideal notion that the Platonic ideal of the tree exists somewhere out there, but really
Well, I
it
think
doesn't. It's just,
that's like the only way it could work
I've
in
already
your
explained to you how it works without that. I've explained it to
well
you.
well the thing is that, for example, when you say so some inductive process is at work. Well, the induction itself is also part of something that on your worldview shouldn't work. And so
No.
language is kind of entangled in that, and that's why like
And
it's like a
induction
web.
works because we evolved the same kinds of, we evolved brains that use models to generate action, because that's an efficient way to basically calculate the best action. To have a map, like, just think of it as a map, right? It's much easier to get around in the world if you know where things are, if you have a map in your head. That
Right,
map
but
isn't
then
a
you kind
hold
of
on. That map
presuppose that
isn't a
those things will stay in those place, right? That's
well.
like
The
what induction
induction
is.
the induction method has certain biases built into it, and those biases have to match reality.
Right.
And if they didn't, then the beings that had those inductive methods that didn't work in this reality would die out, and the ones that had ones that are better adapted to it would succeed. So ultimately, evolution generated this ability to model the world. And think about a map of a city. Do you think that's a Platonic ideal? There's a Platonic ideal of New York City? No, it's just it's a map that people have in their heads that they are constantly updating based on new experience. If they're walking around the city, oh, I didn't know that store was there. Now that's part of my map of New York.
Well, in that sense,
Um,
I think there is a Platonic ideal because nobody has the map exactly accurately represented in their heads, but there is, so to speak, an ideal version of it somewhere out there, so to
well,
speak.
the ideal version of it is just the thing itself. But that ideal version is too big to fit in your head, so you need an abstract concept of it, right? And we evolved to come up with abstract representations of reality because that's the best way to, well, it's really the only way to generate purposeful action, or even, I shouldn't say it's the only way to generate complex action, but at some
Well, I don't
point,
know.
yeah, go ahead.
Look, complex and purposeful, all of these things, like they presuppose so many um, well, they make so many presuppositions that are in no way justified. So maybe let me just get through the whole list because, like I said, it's like a web
Okay.
of things,
Okay.
and maybe then it will be easier for you to reply to the entire thing.
Okay.
Okay? So the first one was meaning in the sense of language, like I explained it, like
Mm-hmm.
abstract concepts. Okay, then meaning in a different sense, because we would lose the kind of the temporal progression from a clearly defined beginning, so creation, to a clearly defined ending, so the end times, right, or the eschaton, as it's sometimes called in religious thinking. So if we don't have a set point that was the starting point of the entire process and then the clear end point, then we can't really make sense of anything like history, like I don't know, even just day-to-day things, right? When I ask you what did you do today or something, you tell me a story. Well, that story kind of presupposes that there was a purpose to what you did, that there is a clearly objectively defined purpose that you can impose on the world, I guess, or that there is an interpretation to the actions uh, that you went through that makes sense, that you could summarize it in terms of like a narrative. Okay, so I would say that that is only possible if time is not like a cyclical thing, which it would be, I think, in Big Bang, according to the Big Bang theory or something like that. And so yeah, that would be, and if you think about it, like human beings, we are constituted in this way that we have to, like, we think from beginning to the end, right? Each sentence has a clear beginning, a middle part, and then an end part. Every process, every day, every life. So that's just how we think about it. But then on the grand scale, it would uh, actually not be true. It would be like a circular thing or just completely meaningless thing. Okay, so the third point is
Well,
regularities
hold
of
on a
any
sec.
kind.
Why don't we take these one at a time, or I'll forget what you were
Oh, okay,
saying. So,
well, because like I was saying, they are kind of connected. So, but yeah, I
okay,
get it.
well,
I
if you
was
want to go
talking too
through,
much about the. I was laying it out too much.
yeah, why don't, okay, then if you want, go through them briefly, like
Yeah,
point by point, and then we can circle back. Otherwise, it's just going
right,
to get confusing.
right. Okay. So, third thing is regularities of any kind in the natural outer world as well as in your inner psyche. So, as well outside as on the inside. Then the fourth thing would be like abstract things like logic or mathematics or geometry or probably even music. And the last point is free will, and thus the ability to reason or actually have meaningful conversations. Okay, so that's it.
Okay, so I guess we could start with the time thing. So, what was your question specifically about that?
Well, if we don't have a clearly defined beginning point and an end point, so that would be when God created the earth, right? The universe, ex nihilo, which is an important part
Well,
of this
can I just point
theology.
out that wouldn't be ex nihilo because God would have to exist? And so there isn't a
Right.
starting point to your story either. I mean, can I start pointing these things out that
Well, the material world didn't exist before that,
no,
right?
but
Because God
the story doesn't
isn't
have a
material.
beginning. The story doesn't have a beginning.
Well, for us it has. For God, maybe it doesn't, but we are not
So
reading the
you've
story from the vantage point of God, right?
well, but so what you've done is, and I've pointed this out to you other times, but you take these things like there's the starting point of or the beginning of causation or whatever, you put
Hmm.
it into the concept of God, and then you think that now it's gone away, that the problem doesn't exist, or that there's no longer any question that we can ask about it. But that doesn't
Well,
solve
okay.
the problem. It doesn't solve your own problem that you're posing. The same thing is true about the meaning problem. But positing God doesn't solve that problem, or positing even the Platonic ideals doesn't actually solve that problem. Because now you have to explain, well, how do we know about the Platonic ideals? Or how do we know God is actually there creating these Platonic ideals, or
Well,
whatever?
God we know from Revelation, right? And it's not just in Scripture, but it's also like everywhere
Well, I
around you.
don't know God from Revelation, so that argument's not going to be persuasive to me.
Well, right, I get that, but I think that like all of these things that I'm listing, they are kind of indirect confirmations.
Well, no, because that would be begging the question. Because you would have to beg the question of God before they don't solve the problems. That's one of the points I was making. First, you're appealing to consequences, saying, "Hey, look, if I posit God, I solve these problems." Secondly, God doesn't solve the problems. You just take the problem, put it into God, and then shuffle it out of consciousness and say we don't think about that. We're not going to worry about how God got started. We're only going to worry about how the universe got started. And you atheists don't have an answer to how the universe got started, but I do. God made it. But that's
Right.
not an answer because you still have to say, where did God come from? You have no answer to that question. You've just taken the question, put it into God, and then said, oh, now I don't have to worry about it. Now it's no longer a question.
Well, it's because you kind of assume that God must then also have a beginning, which is just another presupposition. Well, like
Well,
why
why must the
why
universe
would
have a
he?
beginning then?
Well, because otherwise, like I said, I don't think we can make sense of something that
Why not?
either has multiple beginnings or will forever go on. Like maybe it will go like explode, and then
Well, okay,
sometime
I'll
later
answer the
a new
philosophical.
universe will. Yeah. Okay.
I'll answer your philosophical challenges. I'm just saying you don't have any answers to them. Okay, I'm just saying your answer isn't an answer. But yeah, I can answer it. I mean, regardless of what happened at the beginning of time or how the universe got here, we have experiences of time, right? We have personal stories. And as we experience more and more, and as we develop more and more complex ideas about the world, more complex thought structures, those extend our personal histories outward in time, and also our idea of the world outward in space. So you start out as a baby and you're just you're extremely solipsistic or whatever. You don't know about anything other than your own internal events, essentially. And slowly you start building up knowledge about the world that starts extending in time and space away from yourself. Now, there may not be any ultimate end to that in any of those dimensions, right? But you can go from just understanding mama, well, first just understanding hungry, sad, happy, whatever, then understanding mama, and then understanding objects, and then understanding there's things outside my house, and there's this whole world, and then eventually you can even have ideas about distant galaxies and the entire universe and the Big Bang. These are all models that you can have. But there's no way to go to some ultimate beginning or end, because you can always ask what happened before. From our perspective, this is the thing. We're sort of floating in space and time, or we're moving along time and kind of floating in space, and we can extend our ideas beyond ourselves. But there's no way to get, there's no ultimate end to that. We just never find an end to it, right? We can always ask another question.
But well, yeah, sure, but I think that some questions are just badly formed. So, for example, you can't always ask what was before that. Like, why would you assume that you can always ask that? I mean, that would assume something metaphysical about reality, that there's always a preceding point, which, I mean, you would have to justify why that would be so.
No, it doesn't assume it. It's just asking the question. And if you're saying there's nothing before it, we can't really imagine nothing, right? So that's why we can always ask the question. Because we didn't evolve to have a kind of, total knowledge of the universe, whatever that would be. We're situated beings, we're bodies in a little, part of it that evolved to just figure out our local environments and reproduce, and that's it.
Okay, but I mean, that we cannot picture it doesn't mean that it's therefore false.
Well,
right?
I didn't say one thing was false or true. We talked about asking questions.
Right, and I'm saying that some questions are badly formed, or
perhaps,
whatever.
but then you could just say, well, asking what happened before the Big Bang is badly formed.
Well, why? Why would that be the case?
Well, why is asking what's before God badly formed?
Well, because before God doesn't make sense anyway, but you're asking why there wasn't anything before he made time and space? Well, because there was no time and space.
Okay, so then why should I ask what was before time and space? Why do I need to put God into it? Why can't I just say, well, I can't answer what happened before the Big Bang because there's no way to trace back before that. That's the beginning of all causality in the universe as we know it. I can imagine that there's multiverses and other things and a nested sequence of universes. I can imagine all kinds of things, but
I mean, multiverses would mean that God exists by necessity, right?
No. I don't know where you're getting these things from.
Well, because multiverse means every possibility is actuality. So God is a possibility, therefore God is an actuality, right? Isn't that how they work?
No, I don't know. Not really. It's not everything I can imagine is a reality. The multiverse thing, I think the multiverse thing is just more speculation, right? You can speculate about it. You can't test your speculations, and you can't observe them. So to me, it's all moot. It's irrelevant. It's meaningless. But you can still, just like speculating about what happened before the Big Bang or what exists outside the universe, is kind of a badly formed question. But we can still think it. We can still, ponder it. Nothing stops us, right? It's just that we don't have an answer to it.
No, I get it, but it's just that I have this feeling that all the time that we are getting like sidetracked, or again, sidetracked is the wrong term, but we are concentrating on each single point, and my whole point, or my main point, is that God actually kind of combines all of these loose metaphysical and whatever.
Yeah, God does. God is a telememe. God takes all the loose ends that are philosophical questions and says, like I described it before, puts them in a box, or you put them in a box and call it God, and then say, now I don't have to think about them. Now I'm not even allowed to ask the question. That's all it
Well,
does. It
no,
doesn't
actually, you
solve
can
them.
learn. You can learn like an entire system. It's not like you just say God and that's it, right? Because I mean, I guess we could
But
go into.
it doesn't terminate the infinite regress except by you deciding that it does. That's my point.
Okay, I mean, it's not me personally deciding, but okay, I get the point.
If you agree with this system, yeah, it is you personally deciding it. Yeah, it is. You can't just pass the authority off to somebody else.
Well, no, because I'm not changing the system at all.
But you're making the judgment that it's correct. So you are deciding
Right,
that,
okay.
yeah, oh, I'm going to stop thinking about these problems. I'm going to pretend there's a God. Well, you don't think you're pretending, but you are. And then I'm going to say that God solves these problems. And it doesn't, but you're just claiming it does and then saying, well, I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to question how God can somehow solve these problems. I'm just going to say that I will not ask the question once the idea has been put into the concept of God, right? Like I can ask the question, what happened before the universe? And I'll pose it to the atheist. But I can't ask the question, what happened before God? Or where did God come from? Or who created God? Okay, that's the trick. That's the little game. And it's deception. It's
Well,
a
I mean,
lie. I mean, you're just
it's not necessarily a lie. It's just that maybe it is like this. Like, I mean, at some point, and we already discussed this a little bit, I think, that at some point, sure, at some point it becomes circular. I mean, you have to make this commitment to something in every possible system, because otherwise you could just keep asking into the infinite regress or whatever, or you could say, well, no, this is just an axiom that I'm not going to.
no, you don't have to answer questions by arbitrary declarations. You can just say this is an open question and we may never be able to answer it. Like, what's the beginning of causality, space, and time? I don't think we can answer that question.
Yeah, right, we can't. Which is why just waiting around and saying, for example, well, maybe scientists will come up with like some theory that makes sense. It's just stupid. And I think that this is precisely the point. Something has to be
We
right.
don't have to answer the question. That's my point. We
No,
can
but
just
my
say we
point is
don't
that there
know.
is no alternative to the view that I'm espousing.
No, I've just given you one, which is we don't know. That's the alternative. We don't have to know everything, to do some things. We can just act in the world without having the ultimate knowledge of,
Yeah,
like
sure,
without
I know.
closing off all the infinite regresses of philosophical skepticism. We can just accept that, yeah, there are these infinite regresses. That's our condition as human beings. We don't have any ultimate knowledge. We don't have any foundation. We're floating in space, literally and metaphorically. And we have to deal with that and accept that. That's the alternative.
But how can you state that at the same time when so basically you're saying we cannot know for sure, but then you state something as if you knew that was the case for sure.
No, I
And
just believe I
that is
believe
the
it.
problem
No,
with
no, no, no,
your.
no, 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 no. It's not, and I'll explain why that's not. Okay. In ordinary language, if I say it's raining outside, I'm not saying I have absolute ultimate certainty that it's raining outside. I know that there's no possibility of doubt. I've excluded all philosophical doubt, and not only that, it's a perfect representation of objective reality. That's not what that means. It just means I have this idea in my head. This is my model. My model of the condition right now, well, right now it's not raining. I wish it was. I should use a different example. Um, okay, when I say it's not raining outside right now, that's my model. I can't see outside right now. Maybe it is. Maybe it just started raining. But that's the model I'm working with. And if I say, here's my model of our condition as human beings, we're brains and skulls, we induce knowledge from experience, we have the potential to ask questions that we can't answer. That's what it is to be a human. That itself is a model. And
Okay, look,
I'm not claiming that that's an absolute, guaranteed, certifiable truth. Right up front, the model says it isn't.
right.
It's
Okay,
just the best thing that my brain has come up with. And that's it.
so the two cases are different insofar as with the rain example, you're just saying, well, it's raining right now, whatever, right? It's just a
Mm-hmm.
particular situation. But in the other case, you're positing an ultimate truth. You're saying this is what human nature is. And you can
How
have
is that an
those.
ultimate truth? It's just a model. It's just a model of our condition, right? That I have arrived at by the same process of induction that I arrive at an idea like it's raining outside, or even the concept of rain. Like the concept of rain itself is something I have induced from experience. It varies in certain regular ways with other things, right? Like the street being wet. Well, I've come up with ideas about what we are, right? Like we're brains and skulls. Okay, that's a starting point. The information gets into those brains through nerves and it goes out through nerves. Those brains do things and generate ideas. That's a model. That model is not guaranteed to be, correct. Maybe I'm a brain in a vat, not a brain in a skull. Maybe I'm a character in a video game, right? I mean, there's no ultimate certainty about these things. That's the point of philosophical skepticism. That's the point of I think, therefore I am, right? That if we really try, we can doubt anything, including what I just said. And you
Right.
might call that nihilism, and maybe that's a good word for it. Nihilism is the starting point, in a way, of having a completely rational worldview, one that doesn't make any assumptions a priori.
But you don't really act on that premise, right? I mean, you don't,
Of course I do.
you aren't a nihilist,
Well, I'm not a nihilist, but in the sense of having no beliefs. But I'm a
right?
nihilist in the sense of I don't think my beliefs are guaranteed to be true by for any reason, that they have some ultimate foundation. I act in the world based on the ideas that I have about the world, based on the values that I have induced, based on my emotions. I don't have to have a model of my human condition that says that I have ultimate certainty in anything in order to act in the world. I guess that's the point. Or in order to believe that it's raining outside.
Well, of course, but I never claimed that.
Well, that seems like that's what you're claiming, that I can't act unless I have a foundation for belief. That seems to be what you're saying, right? That if I can't close off the infinite regress, like
Well,
I can't act, I can't do anything. I can't just say, well, I'm going to go off of my best understanding of the world. No, I have to close off the infinite regress about the tree before I walk around it or something like that.
no, I think you can act in the world no matter what worldview you have. Like you can have a faulty worldview and still act in the world. That's no problem. What I'm saying is that basically atheists make use of all of these categories that they actually are arguing against because they can't exist with their presuppositions.
Give me an example of what you think I can't is like ruled out by my presuppositions.
Well, sure, for example, mathematics, like any just one plus one is two. Why does that notion not evolve, for example, just like everything else supposedly evolves?
Well, because it's probably okay in my model. So I have to like qualify everything I say, right? In my model of what mathematics is and how it relates to me as a subject, mathematics is a system of ideas that we have created, and it derives some of its properties from properties of our brains. So the sort of stability of mathematics comes from the stability of our mental processes and their uniformity, right? That like if my notion of a mind that models reality is correct, if that model is correct, well, it implies that the brains have built into them a certain way of representing reality, and that way of representing it has certain constants, like identity, right? Like this store in New York City has an identity. It's different from that store. They're both stores, but this one is different from that one. So I can abstract the general concept of store, but I can have different instances of it, right? And so that is the underlying basis of mathematics, that you have identity and you also have types. So you can start counting things of the same type with different identities. And then you create the symbol system, you can put them into relations to that, and you can go off and create this huge thought structure of mathematics. But it all begins with those properties of the brain.
Right, but it isn't just a thought structure though, because you can't change it, for example. You can't just decide if it's just in your head, if it's just a thought, then you should be theoretically be able to decide that 1 plus 1 is now 4
Well,
instead of 2.
you could do that in terms of the formal system. You can come up with different mathematical systems. So when it's a thought structure like a formal system, you can define it however you want. But as I was saying, that there's that underlying substructure of identity and difference and types that you can't change because it's built into your mental processes. It's a priori procedural knowledge that is, encoded in your genes, so it's not something you can change. You can change what you believe within certain parameters. You can't change the way your brain works. Right? Your
Wait, so
brain does, like induction. You can't decide to change the way your brain induces concepts from experience. That's built into your brain.
right, so do you actually think that that you kind of uh, keep adjusting your principle of induction to the ever-changing world?
No, the principle of induction has to be fixed a priori. What you
Right.
adjust are your models. So the modeling process, the mental processes that generate the models have to be there a priori, prior to experience, and they have to be non-adjustable.
So they got to be right from the outset.
Well, they don't have to be right. I mean, in some ultimate sense, they have to work. Otherwise, you die, right? So I mean, like, they evolved to create reasonably accurate models of reality that model the parts of reality that are relevant to acting in the world for survival and reproduction. So that's what they have to do, and if they don't do that, the organism, dies, and so there's still selective pressure to make that modeling process work.
Okay. I guess, I don't know. Do you think animals do induction in
Oh
some
yeah,
sense?
yeah, of course.
Yeah, so you would say it's just more developed in human beings, but every life form must, to some degree, be able to do induction.
Not every life form, but I think my best guess, based on what I know, is that any life form that learns is inducing, and, well, in some sense. And the kind of modeling, like mapping the world type representational knowledge that we have in our heads, that's probably a shared ability that goes back to some early vertebrate on our line. And then there are other animals that probably have similar things, like, cephalopods, the more intelligent, like octopus, squid, those kind of animals. But yeah, I think fish probably can have some rudimentary ability to learn from experience, model the world, even some very rudimentary reasoning type thing. Yeah.
Mm. All right. Yeah, I mean,
Birds do, obviously. But
yeah,
anyway,
so,
it's
and of course science is uh, completely relies on the principle of induction not suddenly changing, right? Because otherwise you can might as well throw out all of the data that you have uh, gathered up to that point.
yeah, things like science, mathematics, formal logic are all formalizations, or you could say socializations of mental processes. They're attempts to take mental processes that we as individuals are capable of doing and then do them collectively. So do them together and build up knowledge outside of our heads, like put it down in theories and books and, stuff like that, so we can share it and we can think outside our heads. Those are mechanisms for thinking outside your head. And that's why they're so powerful, because they extend thought in ways that our brains are not capable of. Like, no one person could generate all of the knowledge of science in his own head, I don't think. And, no one person can carry out complex differential equations, calculate or solve differential equations or whatever in his head. But we can do it outside of our heads. Once we formalize the rules, like the way it is done in our heads, we can then take those methods outside of our heads and apply them in ways that we couldn't do just as individuals. So that's a bit of a tangent, but that's one way to think about things like science, mathematics, etc.
Yeah, yeah, sure, I get that. And you have to be able to abstract and to share those abstractions for with other people for that to work.
Right. They
And
all do depend on us having that common ability that is sometimes called reason. But yeah, it's basically induction and deduction, this common faculties that our brains have, and some of us have more or less of them, so we're not all the same. But
yeah,
you know,
sure. So I guess I'm asking for justifications for that. Or I mean, I don't know. You kind of gave an answer that we just evolved to do those things, but I
well, that's the
mean,
explanation. That's my model of it. Can I, again, if you're demanding an ultimate justification that I have some ultimate proof that our inductive processes are correct, I don't. The best I can do is model them, and develop a theory of mind and then apply it to myself and say, according to the theory that this mind has developed, is the mind working? But there's a kind of circularity there, right? Because I can never escape to some objective standpoint and evaluate my brain. All I can do is from the perspective of a being that has a certain set of mental processes, a certain way of relating to information, I can use that way of relating, those mental processes, to think about myself, to model myself. But that's not
right.
an ultimate foundation because it doesn't have an objective basis that is outside of myself, that doesn't depend on what's being modeled, right?
Well, but what I'm saying is that when you're doing mathematics, then you can objectively say whether that was right or wrong, you know. So it's
Have you
not,
ever done mathematics? I mean, you screw up all the time, right? You
well,
have to
no,
do
of
it over
course,
and over again, and
but that's what it means that you screw up. It means you got it wrong,
yeah,
objectively wrong.
because you have a norm. So the way these processes work is that there's some norm of correctness, right? Like, there are norms of deductive consistency and norms of induction, like explanatory power, predictive power, right? So these norms are constant because they're built into us at a very deep level. I mean, there are
So
some people who
what
have
what
very poor functioning
uh,
versions of them, right? But how we come up with the idea of what is the norm of induction or deduction is we look at a bunch of people and we see that we can interpret their reasoning attempts or their thinking attempts or their induction attempts as a combination of this ideal plus a bunch of performance factors, errors, and so on. So there's like systemic error, random error, and then this ideal. That's a way of analyzing it and explaining it. That's the meta model. Just like we can say that, oh, living beings are trying to reproduce, that's the norm of biology, even though most living beings don't reproduce. It's not a description, but it's a description of the form. The function explains the form. So we understand the functions of living beings, we understand the forms of living beings as serving the function of reproduction, even if most of them die without reproducing. It's a bit of a tangent, but we can abstract ideals from observation without the ideal being a description of what we see. But it's just one of the components that describes it. Does that make sense?
okay. Yeah, sure.
I mean, like, okay, if you see a lion chasing an antelope, not catching it, chasing another one, not catching it, chasing another one, not catching it, chasing one and catching it, he's trying to catch the antelope, even though on average he doesn't. So it's something like that. Our brains generate both. They generate functional models of things, not just causal models. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. I shouldn't have gotten into
Yeah, so
this.
I guess what I'm wondering is where do you think mathematics resides, so to speak?
Well, the fundamental underlying basis of it is just brain structures or the structure of our mental processes. But mathematics as a formal system is something we created. So it resides in culture, but it's based on biology. So there's an underlying biological, you could say, foundation, but not an ultimate foundation, but there's a foundation in our brains.
So by saying we created that, would you then say that at some point before we came up with mathematics, the number seven didn't exist?
Well, I don't think the number seven exists now in the sense that you're implying. The number seven is a representation that we use, right? That we apply to experience to reason about experience.
But
Do
I
I
think
think?
you can actually show that the number seven must be real because the number one is real, and
Well,
you can show that the number one is real by showing that you necessarily have to assume that it's real, otherwise you can't even predicate things in the
well, that
world.
doesn't prove that something is real if it's like a necessary precondition for thought, because it could reside in the subject, not the object, right? So just because something is sort of necessary aspect of how we see the world, or model it, or understand it, it does not follow that that's objective. It just means that it's inescapable. It could still be part of the subject, because you can't escape from a subjective perspective. There is no other perspective that you can adopt. Look at the world and say, okay, is seven really there, or was that just something that was in the way the subject was seeing the world?
Well, I guess again, I would say that if you do some calculation or you construct some building and you use mathematics in your architectural work, then at the end of the day, if the house is stable, then everybody can
Well,
see that you probably did those things correctly
yeah.
and
Well,
didn't fuck it up.
it doesn't mean that the number seven is objectively real. It means that your mental processes interact with reality in a way that generates effective action, so that you can act in the world in this way, building a building that doesn't fall down, so that
Yeah,
you're
but
able to model reality in a way that is effective for your purposes.
so that was I was trying to show you that it's not all purely subjective, right?
No, it isn't purely subjective. It's both, right? The subject, again, in my model, I have to qualify everything. My model that you're a brain and a skull, the skull is connected to this external world, right? So what goes out through the nerves is going to impact that external world, and what comes in through the nerves is going to depend on that external world. So the representations, the thought structures, whatever you want to call them, depend on objective reality, but they are not equivalent to it, and the properties of those thought structures need not be properties of objective reality, because they could be properties of the subjective perspective. Okay, because all of them depend on both. They depend on the subject and the object.
Right, okay. So yeah, so I guess I still don't get it. Are you like a solipsist at the end of the day, or what is
Well,
your
what does
position?
that what
How would you characterize your position, or do you have like an ism that goes along with it?
I don't have an ism. I guess you could say rationalism. I don't know. That term has other meanings though. I model myself a certain way. I model the relation of the self to the world in a certain way. I wouldn't call that solipsism. Solipsism is kind of like, I mean, depending on how you define it, it could be something like all that matters is my subjective experiences. The objective world is sort of irrelevant.
Well, I don't know about irrelevant. I think that if you say that only your subjective experience matters, it still kind of relies on the outside world. I think a solipsist would say that the outside world doesn't really exist. It's
Yeah,
all
well,
like his imagination.
yeah, well, my model wouldn't doesn't have that implication. It has the implication that I'm a brain and a skull in an objective world that has certain mental processes that's trying to make sense of that world, model it in a certain way, and my only access to that world is either through the models that represent it internally, that or it's through the nerves coming in and going out. That I can act into the world through nerves. I can receive information from that external world through nerves, but that information is not the thing itself. It's just how the external world is interacting with my sensory nerves, right? And then in my head I construct some model, my brain does, I don't consciously do it, of what's going on, and that model is what I internally experience and how I relate to the world. but it isn't the same as objective reality.
Um, right. Okay. I guess okay. And so the world is just the way it is because that's the way it is, and we don't really have to ask those final questions, so to speak,
Well, I
because
think
we
we
can
should.
just pragmatically act in the world without
Mm,
our model being completely correct.
well, I wouldn't say that we shouldn't ask the questions. I do ask the questions. What I'm saying is that, according to my understanding of my condition, the human condition, as a brain and a skull, I'm always going to be seeing the world from a subjective perspective. There is no objective foundation on which my beliefs rest. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so that's what I kind of have problems with because I don't understand exactly. You kind of seem to be going back and forth between subject and object matter or exist to only you can only ever be sure that the subjective perspective exists.
I'm just saying, and again, this is all done through a model, right? So I have a model of the self in the world. But what I'm saying is the relation of the self to the world is, as I've described it, there is no like absolute certainty or absolute knowledge or foundation other than the a priori knowledge that's built into my brain that is inescapable and an inescapable part of the condition, right? Like, I think, therefore I am kind of sums it up, even though it's a little bit misleading. It's like, I have no, that's the ultimate thing, right? Like, if I go back down the chain of skepticism, the only thing I can't really doubt is I exist, and in
Well,
the
but
form of a thought process.
right, so what is I in that case?
Yeah,
Because
just the thought process itself.
just right, so a thought process exists.
Right. So that's like sort of the ultimate thing, but the thought process is coming up with ideas about the world.
Right, and also language exists.
Well, no, language doesn't have to exist. I mean, that's a different thing, but to talk about it does, but not to think about it. But
Do you think you can think without language? Sorry for.
yeah, of course, because you can reason about, like, you can imagine a tree, you can reason about geometrical objects, solve problems that are not linguistic.
Huh, okay.
But anyway, the thought process can think about itself, right? And it can ask these philosophical questions. That's what philosophy is. It's the thought process. Philosophy is really a consequence of psychology in a way. When you're trying to understand yourself, and not just yourself as an object in the world, like I'm sitting in a chair, but yourself as a mind, as, how do I know something, or what am I experiencing, or how can I act in the world? When you start trying to develop that psychological model, you come to the conclusion that you don't have any ultimate guarantees, right? It's kind of disconcerting to realize that your beliefs are just ideas in your head that were generated by a blob of jelly that has neurons firing away. That that's all it is. That's kind of disconcerting. But that's the best model that thought process can come up with.
Well, I don't know about disconcerting. I think there's just as many like emotionally based arguments against the existence of God as there is for. So, for example, you can say, well, I can do whatever I want since God doesn't exist, right? So that
Yeah,
makes
but
it like more attractive to certain
I'm
individuals.
talking about philosophy, though. I'm not talking about. This isn't specifically dealing with atheism or theism, because I've always been an atheist, but that doesn't mean I was always philosophically aware. I've never believed in God, but that doesn't mean that, when I was 5 years old, I really grasped, I think, therefore I am. Uh,
Right.
anyway, that's what I was saying, is that
So, so wouldn't
philosophy
you
consists of
say,
these looping
uh,
around on yourself, and understanding that you're floating in the abyss. You always assume that, oh, well, I see a tree, it's because the tree's there and I see it. You just take your brain for granted, but when you start thinking about it, you see that it's much more tenuous, in a sense. Your relation to reality is different than what you sort of naively assumed.
well, I don't know if you can know that. I think that largely depends on your, uh, again, worldview probably, or
Yeah, sure, but seeing that these questions exist and that you don't have an answer to them. Now you're going to say you have an answer, and that's where we disagree. But did you
right.
ever become aware of the philosophical questions outside of the context of Christian apologetics, though? Because it seems to me that you understand these things as attacks on atheism and not as like really deep questions that a mind can ask about itself.
Well, no, sure, I understand both functions. It's not so much that I'm out to attack atheism. It's just more that I kind of try to understand and, so to speak, so grapple with these things. And I also want to see if I at least understood them correctly so that I can kind of, defend that position, right?
Okay.
And so that's why I was interested in talking about this because I think I kind of understand the whole well debate between theism and atheism. So basically, yeah. So your position, it's always gonna sound something along those lines that we cannot know for sure. We do the best that we can with the models that we construct, and at the end of the day, it's all kind of depends on the person, right? Because you can't escape your own head, so to speak.
Right.
And so then, yeah, so philosophies, I mean, you can be like the smartest philosopher ever, or you can be like the dumbest guy. But at the end of the day, you simply construct a subjective model, and that's as best as it gets, so to speak. It
Yeah.
can never be grounded in some objective truth.
Right. It always just goes back to that's what my brain is coming up with.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. You have nothing else to rely on other than your brain ultimately.
I still kind of think that that's self-refuting because then this notion itself also just came from your brain, and so you have no way of knowing. So this, in other words, you have no way of knowing if you are correct or if you are wrong.
Right. It's not self-refuting. It applies to itself. You come to believe that you have no answers to these questions by induction the same way, if you try to answer them, if you ponder philosophical questions for years and years, you come to believe, well, I guess there's no way to get outside my head because I've been trying for 5 years. But maybe there is. Yeah, there is no ultimate certainty. That's not a contradiction.
But is that not an indication to you that maybe there is something outside? Like, to me, in other words, it seems to me that you're simply denying this possibility from the outset, and you're saying, well, God is just not allowed, not permissible in my world.
No, God wouldn't change anything though. That's actually something I've mentioned before that, this Sartre said this, that even if the point of existentialism, that's another way we could talk about this. Instead of using the term nihilism, you could say it's existentialism. He said that the point of existentialism is not atheism. It's that even if God existed, it wouldn't make any difference. We would still have these problems.
No, because we just said that you would have an objective grounding.
You wouldn't, though. The belief in God would still be an idea in your head.
Right, but we are not so much talking about belief because belief doesn't make God real, right? But I mean, the existence of God would give you an objective basis
Well,
for.
you believe that God exists, right?
Right,
But you also, I'm sure, believe that there are crazy people, right?
sure.
And people who make mistakes and people who have wrong beliefs about the world. And
Yes, of course, and Christians also make mistakes and can also be crazy. Like it's not an antidote to like the human condition or something like that. And I never claimed that, or at least I
okay.
hope you don't have this impression that I'm like using this to say, well, now that I at least claim to believe in God, now like the universe has revealed all its secrets to me or something like that. Like that's not my point.
Well, it does kind of seem to be the point, though. Or if not, then the belief in God itself would be dubious.
Well, no, because you at least can explain the world around you.
But I can explain the world around me. I've already
Yeah, I
explained to
get
you how I
that,
explain it.
but it's not grounded in anything. So basically, then
Well,
you can say, well, there are crazy people, there are people who make mistakes. They all can explain the world to some extent, and some of them will have like crazy explanations, and some will have wrong explanations, and some will have better explanations. But ultimately, there is no way to even know what better or worse constitutes because there is no objective uh, bar.
But you have no way of doing that either. You just assume that, oh, God exists and God provides me with this somehow, even though at the same time you believe you make mistakes, you accidentally, trip over tree roots when you're walking down the street or something.
Yeah.
I mean, you have no, you can't, um, and now I'm getting an echo. I think
Oh,
if you just,
sorry. I'm moving around a bit. Okay.
oh, okay. Like, why don't you try to explain how God gives you this foundation? Because you've been interrogating my worldview quite a bit, so let's interrogate yours. How does God give you this foundation for belief?
Sure. Right. So the way this so the way this worldview works is you have a doctrine of creation, right? And so that's when God creates everything out of nothing, and He creates the human being in His image. And so that being created in His image already tells you something, that you have a personal connection to God. And so things like logic, things like mathematics, geometry, laws of logic, right, law of non-contradiction, modus ponens, whatever else we mentioned, all of those things are contained in the mind of God. And you, being constituted in His image, can access not the entire mind of God, of course, because you are limited and finite, but that's how you can actually use those concepts like logic. Because if you assume that it's like a dimension of forms, right, like in Plato, then there is no bridge between the material and fluctuating world and the world of forms in Plato. So, in other words, logic might exist, but we just don't really have any access to logic or know or can know how it works and when it works and why it doesn't work and all of that. Okay, so yeah, so that's basically the gist of it. So you have a specific human nature that's not like randomly evolved over millions and billions of years or whatever, but it was purposefully created by a creator with all the faculties that you have. So you have a body, a soul, and you have a spirit. And the spirit is basically how you can perceive God around you, right? So that's how you have access to these things called logoi, that are like the essences of things,
Okay,
basically.
but how does this model give you confidence in, I don't know, how does it give you a foundation?
Right. So, for example, if you go to Genesis, I think it's 8. I'm not pretending to know like the Bible very well. I just finished reading Genesis, but I think it's in Genesis 8 where, for example, after the flood, God comes down to Noah and he makes
But you're just describing the model in more detail. But I mean, I'm just saying, how do you, as a subject, how does this give you a foundation for your beliefs, which would include this model itself?
so I mean, I guess you read about it. I don't understand. Like you have to make this commitment. It's not like like
So
I
you
mean,
don't. So you don't have a foundation. Your foundation is just, I choose to believe this is true. I choose not to question it. That's the foundation. It's not a foundation. It's just you making this choice.
well, is it? I mean, you can rely on scripture, for example.
But that's you making the decision to rely on scripture.
Sure, of course, yes.
So it all goes back to your judgment. It's all based on you
Yes,
choosing.
but you can be wrong or you can be right in your judgment, even without knowing.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you have an objective foundation for your judgment. It's still your subjective judgment that this model is correct or not correct. It's just that it's
Yes,
just that
probably, probably.
your model tells you that you got stuff from God, but it's still a model in your head that you're subjectively judging to be correct.
Sure, but you can explain all of these things that you cannot explain on any other worldview.
Well, you haven't demonstrated any explanation of anything, and that is also an appeal to consequences. Like, so, let's say you go back 10,000 years and somebody says, I can't explain why it rains. And somebody says, oh, well, that's God, peeing or something. You could say, well, look, my worldview explains the rain and yours doesn't. But
Right.
it doesn't really explain it. It's just, oh, I just came up with some ad hoc.
Yeah, of
Um,
course, but that's like God of the gaps. That's not what I'm talking about.
Though that is what you're talking about. You're saying, look, there are these gaps, which are these philosophical problems, and I'm going to paper over them with God. I'm just going to assume God
No,
solves them.
it's more like it's the foundation, right? It's not, well, here's a gap, so that must have been God. You're just saying that the presuppositions for everything that we know, like all our knowledge, all of our experience, all of our day-to-day life, those can only be granted by a being that is describable in those terms, like the biblical God. So omnipotence and all of that stuff.
Only if they have the properties you want them to have, which
Yes.
they don't even have the properties that you want them to have. But, like, I can explain them. I can say, well, these abilities, like induction and deduction, evolved because organisms evolved to act in the world effectively. And so the laws of physics and biology can provide the same level, well, more than the same level of explanation. They can actually explain the process. They explain why there is a similarity between the way humans act and dogs and chimps and all these other things. And so they go well beyond that. They explain, oh, why we need a brain, why we have this blob of jelly in our heads. They explain why we make mistakes, why we need to learn. Like, why would God give you this ability to see the Platonic ideals, but it takes you 20 years to learn them? Like, I don't see how that would explain any of those things.
Um,
Why would God give you
I
this half-assed thing that screws up all the time? It's just,
Oh, well, because I mean, we would have to go further along scripture, right? Because that's the standpoint that I choose, and so I would explain that probably with the fall that we are now susceptible to death and to pain and to our brains failing and dementia and all of that. So, but okay, I mean, you just said deduction and induction evolved. Well, at what point in time did modus ponens evolve into its form, and why isn't it evolving further? Like, why is it now set in stone and
well,
doesn't
I
seem to
I
be changed?
think
Yeah.
well, modus ponens is in formal logic is something we have abstracted from our reasoning. So that's like a rule of, first order logic that we've created the system. So the external system, just like mathematics and science, is something we have created to do collective reasoning with, so that and as a kind of meta theory of what our brains are doing. The concept, or the not the concept, the structure of a conditional evolved probably 500 million years ago when the basic structure of the brain evolved, because the most essential aspect of knowledge is conditionality. So really, modus ponens is about applying a conditional knowledge, right? So that
Well,
would have evolved a long time ago, and it's not
what do you mean by conditional?
like if P then Q, right? Modus ponens is you start with if P then
Okay,
Q,
okay, yeah,
and
I get
P
it.
as premises, you go to Q, right? Well, pretty much all of applying knowledge to the world is of that form, where you compute an implication of some knowledge, which then allows you to act in the world. So I would say that the biological basis of modus ponens is one of the earliest things that evolved. It's part of this ability to represent reality, to model it. It's an essential aspect of that. Why doesn't it evolve further? Well, there's really nowhere else for it to evolve.
Yeah, but what did it look like when it was half evolved?
Well, I don't think it was half evolved. I mean, I think
Well,
conditionality.
how can it evolve without being
Well, I don't. I mean,
half
I
evolved?
don't know exactly how conditionality is represented in neurons, other than probably, that neurons communicate through synapses, and so one neuron fires, the other one fires. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't
Okay.
have an answer to every single question about how our brains work. I'm just
Yeah, well, I'm not
telling
so
you that
much.
we don't
Um,
have to posit God. I mean, I could ask you, does God have a bum? Does he have an anus? I mean, I can ask all kinds of questions about God that you might find hard to answer.
well,
But that doesn't
sure.
really, it's kind of besides the point, right? I mean, I can explain to you why we have these, why there are these very general principles of reasoning built into our brains, and thus why they are constant, without claiming that there is some sentient being that has all this stuff in his head to begin with.
But
And
why are some
and
things
wait, just let me
constant?
hold on.
Okay, okay, sorry.
Well, and also, you again, it's one of these things where you don't actually answer the question, because I could ask you, why did God have modus ponens in his brain?
Sure, okay.
Right? I mean, it's just you don't. It doesn't answer the question. It's just putting it into God and then saying, "Well, I don't have to answer it now because I just stuck it in God's brain." So if it's in a human brain, well, then I have to answer the question, and I have to explain exactly how it evolved and give me the specific, point in evolutionary history and how it happened. But if I just stick it in God's brain, I don't have to talk about it. Don't have to explain it at all. That's bullshit. That's just like a trick, right? That's not rational.
Well, I mean, that must be the case if you don't claim that you can have absolute knowledge, right? There must be something that's always outside of your knowledge because you're finite, and you, by definition, cannot grasp something that's infinite. I mean, like you are excluding God as an answer from the get-go because you say, well, you can never fully know him, and so what good does it do? But I mean, if he's really infinite, then there is no possibility for a human being to ever know him fully.
Well, then what's the point of invoking this thing that you can never understand? Why not
Well,
just say I don't know? Why have this God and put all of your I don't knows into God and call it God instead of just calling it a big bucket of I don't knows?
well, I guess if you want to talk about the pragmatical side of it, um, I mean, I guess you can build a civilization on religion, and you can build it on whatever type of atheism you are defending.
Well, that
So, I
might,
mean,
I don't know. We haven't tried yet. I mean, it's
well,
true
we
that
kind of
it's
tried
true.
in the
Well, it's just
20th
hold on.
century, right?
Well, I mean, China, Buddhism and Taoism are not really at all like your conception of God. They're very different.
Right.
Or you could say Islam, or you could say the
Yes.
Japanese, who have this blend of Zen Buddhism, which is really Zen Buddhism is like, let's meditate on the paradox of self-referentiality. They're kind of like, let's make the ultimate paradoxes into the highest principle, rather than some kind of foundation. They're like, let's meditate on the lack of a foundation. So Japan is a great example of something that has absolutely nothing like your conception of God and built a very advanced civilization, and it looks like they're going to outlast ours. So I wouldn't go down that road.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not like it would go too much outside of the scope of this video, I think, to now critique other religions as well. And I'm not really able to do that.
I mean, it would be appeal to consequences too. You might say, look, we have to trick everybody into believing this crazy idea to save civilization. And I might agree with you, but that doesn't mean I'm going to believe it.
Okay, so I have a question about this appeal to consequences, right?
Sure.
So this is a fallacy, you're saying. Is it also a fallacy if if you're so to speak, how to phrase this? If the view you are espousing is, in your opinion, the only possible way how it could have worked, is it then still an appeal to consequences?
I'm a little bit confused.
So in other words, I'm not so much arguing that it would be the best outcome to propose a world that's based on God, but that it would be the only explanation. And so you can exclude all the other
Well,
alternatives because they don't make sense.
that would be a different claim, but I mean, that's not usually how it's presented. I mean, first of all, if you're saying the other alternatives are contradictory, they're
Yes.
not. They're not, and they're not. You'd have to demonstrate that, and I think I've already shown you there's no contradiction there. And you'd have to demonstrate that your position didn't lead to that contradiction. So you can show that something is logically necessary, I suppose, if but there is no contingent claim that is logically necessary
Well,
by
look,
definition. So your claim isn't a logically necessary claim. If you're appealing, so yeah, I'm just saying the appeal to consequences is like you have some claim about what is real or what is essential to the human condition or something like that, right? But then you present it as if it's a choice between two flavors of ice cream. You say, look, do you want the shit flavored ice cream or do you want the chocolate flavored ice cream? Come on, you want the chocolate flavored ice cream, right? You don't want the one that tastes like nihilism. You want the one that tastes like God. But the question isn't a matter of preferences. We can't just, pretend that something is true and that makes it true. It's not a choice. It's not like we get to choose.
exactly, that's what I'm saying. But you just said my argument would have to be logical and I would have to show contradictions in your argument, right?
Well, just showing a contradiction in my argument wouldn't prove that yours is correct, but
No, but why appeal to logic at all? This is my question. Why are you saying now that I have to be logical?
oh, you don't. I mean, you can be illogical if you want. I'm just appealing to that common ground in our brains, right? I'm saying, hey, I'm going to, just as like all communication is based on this assumption, it's not a magical presupposition, it's just a working assumption that our brains are similar. So if I say some words, you're going to kind of get what I'm saying, and your brain is going to have the same kinds of laws of thought as mine. So if I point out to you that, well, Q really doesn't follow from P, eventually you're going to say, oh, yeah, you're right, it doesn't. I know that's somewhat optimistic. It's an optimistic working assumption, but it's not making some kind of transcendental metaphysical assumption. It's just usually when you appeal to reason, well, depending on the particular nature of the topic, you can show someone how to get to the truth or how they are wrong. You can bring out the contradictions in their beliefs or show how one thing doesn't logically follow from another or whatever. So when I'm appealing to logic or rationality or whatever, I'm appealing to a norm, and you could say it's like a meta theory of correct thought, which is that ideal that has been abstracted from observation of how people think. That's all it is. I'm not appealing to some ultimate thing. I'm not saying you must be rational. I can't do that. You can very well be irrational, in which case I might not be able to ever convince you of anything, right? You could be completely crazy. I have no guarantees.
Right. And that would be worse in your opinion if I was completely crazy, right? Than if I was logical.
Well, it would be harder to communicate ideas. The point of appealing to logic is an attempt to appeal to common ground, a common mental process that we presumably share. I think you share it. I think you are capable of logical reasoning. So I'm appealing to that faculty in your brain and saying, hey, look. And I think
Yeah,
if I
so
should.
so I guess I'm kind of thinking in terms of because I also told you beforehand that I think that like all of these logical laws that you necessarily have to follow them, right? And so I don't know, I still think that this is the case. You of course can still make a mistake and so according to you act irrationally then so to speak. But that just means that you made a mistake. You were still following a logical procedure. You just made an error. And so I think that these logical constraints they can't be circumvented really. And so we are kind of slaves to them, if you will.
Yeah, to some extent. I don't know. People can be pretty illogical. But yeah, that we're sort of slaves to our brains.
Well, no, I wouldn't call it to our brains. I would say that these laws of logic, etc., they exist in reality. They don't exist just in our
Well,
brains.
you
So
can say
in
that, but
objective reality.
You can say that too, but I mean the point I'm making is that the laws of thought are built into our brains, and um, that's why we follow them more or less, and that's why we can appeal from like one person can make an appeal to logic to another person because those people share the same mental processes. And if they didn't, even if the laws had some objective reality, which I don't think they do, but even if they did, they would still have to have the same mental processes, right? If one person was completely crazy, like they just had some, really bad electric shock to the brain and they couldn't think logically, appeal to logic wouldn't work. So it depends on that common mental process, that common faculty.
All right. Okay, I mean, I kind of get it, right? So we're not gonna agree on this, but I mean, we don't have to. So I kind of understand your position. I mean, I don't really have any way to kind of further attack it or something, and so I think we could just end it here for now. And
Um,
or
yeah,
did you want
well,
to
let
add
me
something?
just go through some of the criticisms you made. I actually just want to address them briefly. I mean, so
Okay.
yeah, I think there is an appeal to consequences fallacy, which is kind of illogical because it's a confusion between a truth judgment and a value judgment, right? That you
Okay.
get, or a choice of, it's not like a choice to believe one thing versus another. It's a question of what is the right thing to believe.
What is more logical to believe, I would
Yeah,
say.
what's more logical according to the norms of thought, whatever. We're appealing to some common ideal. Yeah. So I think there is an appeal to consequences in it. And I think I'm right about that. I think you could go back and look at what Jay Dyer says and see if that's not the case. But I really do think that argument is based on appeal to consequences. And I think my other criticisms of it are also accurate. That it does not provide you with an ultimate foundation. It just posits that these problems do not exist because of God. However, the problems still exist with God. It's just that when it comes to God, you say, I will not inquire into the nature of God, or
Well,
I
you
will not
can't.
ask. Well, that's what you claim, right?
Well, how can you inquire into something that's infinite?
Okay, so then you admit that the questions are not answered by the concept of God, since you cannot know God. Then you
But
cannot solve any problem with God if you
but
don't
then
understand God.
you wouldn't admit any other explanation because no explanation can be absolute.
Well, yeah, I'm not. That's my point, right? I've been saying that all along. There is no ultimate answer to some of these questions. There is no way to know, like, what was there before the Big Bang. But saying that God was there before the Big Bang, but on the other hand, saying, but I can't really know anything about God, is a contradiction. Because if you don't know anything about God, you don't know He was there before the Big Bang.
Okay, so you would say we just can't have explanations that are total in their scope, and so therefore,
That's what I believe, but my point is that positing God just doesn't do any of that. It's just claiming that you have an answer, but by not asking the question, right? By saying God answers the question, but I can't ask the same question of God. And
okay,
that's
but
what I'm
how would you test if I'm wrong or if I'm right in that case?
about God.
Yeah.
What do you mean test if you're right?
Well, because you're saying, well, you can assume this position, I can assume this other position, and basically, how would you tell which position is better?
Well, in this case, it's just Occam's razor, but it's also the fact that God is it doesn't do what you claim it does. That's my point. Whether I'm not I'm not saying God doesn't exist. There's no reason to believe in God. So, yeah, I don't think God exists. But the
Okay,
point
in
is
my
even the point that
argument,
I'm making though is that even if God existed or it doesn't really matter. Like it doesn't solve the claims you make about God do
okay.
not actually solve the problems
So
of
I guess my
philosophy.
argument would be that it's the only position that's tenable, and every other position is collapses into absurdity. And so that would be the
But
argument.
you
And I
haven't
feel like you
demonstrated
are,
that.
and I feel like you are equating that with an appeal to consequences, which I think there must be some distinction between those, because if it's an right, because if everything else besides that is absurd,
Well, I
then
wouldn't. No,
it's the only option at that
my
point.
point is that everything else is not absurd. There's no contradiction in what I have told you. My worldview has no contradictions in it. It just doesn't give you the ultimate answer that you seem to think is necessary to have beliefs, but it doesn't make contradictions. You think it does because you're mixing things up. You're mixing up like contingent, like when somebody says it's raining outside, like you're assuming that knowledge has to have this ultimate foundation. That's one of your a priori assumptions. I'm saying knowledge doesn't have to have this foundation. But anyway,
Isn't that an a priori claim that it doesn't have to?
that's my model of knowledge. But you can't pull out of the ether the claim that it does.
Okay.
That's just an assumption. That's what I'm saying, that you have to make that assumption in order to claim that there's some contradiction. You have to claim that anytime somebody, uses mathematics, that somehow contradicts atheism, because when to use mathematics, they must have an ultimate foundation for mathematics.
Well, no, they
And
don't
I'm
have
saying
to.
that's an assumption. That's not.
They don't have to have the foundation in order to use it, but they can't explain it.
Well, I think I've already explained it, but there's just no ultimate explanation. You're saying if your claim has to do with ultimate explanations, right? Not just explanations.
Right. So I guess my question would be, why are there things in the world that seem to be constant, and besides those things, everything else seems to be in flux, evolving, right? In evolution, however you want to call it. But why are there those two types of things, two categories of things?
Well, I would say that that's sort of inevitable. First of all, I would say that, well, that's just the way things are, and I don't have an ultimate answer, but there is a way to reduce the complexity of that a little bit by saying that any mind, when it looks at the world, is going to see order and chaos, because if everything was completely orderly, the mind wouldn't be able to distinguish itself from reality. There would be nothing to predict, nothing to explain. Then you'd have pure solipsism. If everything was chaos, the mind also couldn't exist, because there'd be no way to connect one thing to another. So it's kind of like, I can give you an anthropic principle argument for why that is, that any mind looking at the world is going to see both order and chaos. But as for why as for some ultimate reason, like why is the world here at all, I can't give you an ultimate answer. But I can tell you that God doesn't answer that question either. It just pushes it off one level. It just says, oh, well, God made it. Okay. Well, why is God here then? That's the question now.
Okay, but isn't that somehow akin to saying, like, let's say a car crash, right? 5 people are in a car crash, and 4 of them are dead, and the sole survivor then gets interviewed about the event, and the guy kind of asks him, well, why is it that you are the only one who survived? And then the guy can kind of answer, well, because otherwise I wouldn't be giving this interview.
Yeah, that's the anthropic principle. But your answer would be, God selected me to survive.
But the anthropic principle is not an answer, right? He didn't survive
it's not an
because
ultimate
he couldn't
answer.
otherwise give the interview. He survived for another reason.
It's not an ultimate answer, but it is important to understand that some things are built into the perspective of the seer. Like, people sometimes say, isn't it amazing that this planet, of all the planets in the universe, has life on it? Well, it's not really amazing, because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here asking the question, right? Anytime intelligent life is going to exist, it's going to exist in a place where intelligent life can exist.
Yeah, I get
right?
that.
So you have to understand that some things are built into the perspective from which you're viewing the world, and not necessarily, they might not be universals about the world or about every possible world or whatever. But
But
I'm
then,
not claiming an ultimate answer, right? But I'm just saying you don't have an ultimate answer either. Your answer is just, oh, God. Well, since I'm not restricted from asking questions about God, that doesn't give me any ultimate answers.
yeah, sure, but I mean, just because people don't know the answers to those questions, like, what does that tell you? Like, nobody has absolute knowledge. Yeah.
Right, exactly, which is my position, not yours, right? Um,
Well, no, actually, I admitted that nobody can know the nature of God, so I'm kind
yeah,
of
so you've kind of
also
admitted it too. It's just
admitting.
that, okay, so then your worldview then doesn't have an ultimate foundation, doesn't have ultimate knowledge. It's got this big unknown at the end, this big question mark that is God. At the end of
Yep.
the infinite regress, you've got this big question mark that is God. And I'm just saying that's just a replacement for a bunch of other question marks, and beyond that, it doesn't do anything else. And then it has all these spandrels and epicycles on it, like the Bible and all this other stuff. That's the analogy to the seven-headed pig. The point of that was it could be a lot of different things, and your argument wouldn't be changed,
Well, it
right?
would because the seven-headed pigs we don't know anything about, right? Like
You
what?
don't know anything about God, though. You just admitted that.
Well, but you have the Bible to learn something about him. Like, where is the Bible about the seven-headed pig God?
Yeah, but the Bible is just a book that has all kinds of weird stories in it, that has all kinds of contradictions in it. And I mean, I wouldn't say that's knowledge of God. I'm sorry, I don't think it is.
Well, it gives you some idea.
But the point is that if that's your argument, then you should make that argument. You should say, look, I believe in God not because of this transcendental argument, but because of the Bible.
Well, why can't it be both? And also, I'm saying revelation is not only biblical, but it's actually, in some sense, natural, right?
Well,
If
I'm saying
you,
there's a bait and switch where you go from the transcendental argument, even if, like, let's say that the transcendental argument wasn't fallacious and it was persuasive. At the end of that, I would still not have to believe in anything about the Bible. I wouldn't have to believe that God isn't a seven-headed pig, or that none of the stuff about the Christian God follows from the transcendental argument, even if it was a correct argument. But that's why
well,
it's less important, because it's not a correct argument. But
well, there are problems with different conceptions of God, but like I said, let's not go into different religious concepts because that would take too long, probably. So yeah, just keep going with the critique, I guess.
well, I'm just going through it quickly because we've covered a lot of this already. Yeah, I pointed out that faith is what holds up God, and you've pretty much admitted that, revelation or maybe the Bible. But ultimately, it's your faith, it's your brain believing it that makes you believe it. Believing in God is not a way to get outside your head. It's not an objective ground on which you can stand.
Yeah, but I guess we have enough evidence that there are things outside of my head, I think. So I don't necessarily have to
No,
get
no, no. There
outside
are
of my
things
head.
outside of your head, but that doesn't mean that your understanding of them is objective, because you
Yeah,
are
sure. Yeah.
modeling them within your head, and you're doing that with God as well. And if you can be mistaken about things, we have plenty of evidence that we are mistaken about things too, right?
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, okay, so, but we've covered most of this stuff. Yeah, I think we covered it all. I was just looking through it. I printed it up your thing from before, but I think we've gone through it. So yeah, I guess we can end it there. I think it was a good discussion. Went quite long, but these things usually do.
Yeah, it was fun. All right, cool. Have a nice day.
Yeah, you too. All right, bye.
Thanks.